Good evening, everybody. Those at the conference, welcome back. Those who are new or just here for the Romero lecture, welcome. This is again, we're in the midst of the Romero days, and when we do this biennial conference, we always include the Romero days within our Catholic Social Tradition conference. So 2 years ago, I know many of you were here for Cardinal Turkson, who spoke about the African perspective of Archbishop Romero, and it'll be a delight tonight hearing from Julian, which Father Bob will introduce. I just wanted to go over a couple brief things. A number of folks have been asking me about the videotaping of the different keynotes. So you notice we have videotaped all the keynotes. We'll actually receive a link that from the university, and we'll make sure that we'll send an email for those who are registered, a link to those keynotes. So you'll get those, because folks have asked about buying those or a way to access those. We'll just email all those who are registered that link so that you'll get that. The other thing is that a number of you have talked to me about you're also doing conferences. You're doing conferences in Latin America and Chile, in different places, India, and so you want to make sure folks were aware of that. If you give us that information, we could include that in the email to let folks know about whether other Pacem and Terris or other CST conferences. We can share that information with the folks that are also registered, as long as you give us that information to share that. And just lastly, tomorrow, just so you know, our last day starts at 8:30. So it starts a little early because, again, there's a number of colloquium sessions. So if you could, again, out of respect for those who are presenting, again, there'll be food out in the hallway, so you can grab food here. I know many of you eat at the hotel, but we're going to be starting tomorrow at 8:30. But again, we end a little earlier tomorrow. So we'll be done within here by 4 o'clock, and then there's those who wish to celebrate Palm Sunday, you can go to Basilica. There's also places if you want to go to other times if you're here over the weekend. A beautiful place, actually, St. Mary's at Loretto starts at 9:30 tomorrow, not 9:45, the usual time. The sisters would welcome you there also. But again, thank you all for being here. I'm going to turn things over to a man who is an institution, a man who still rides his bike every day to work, a man who I'm blessed to have an office next to at the Center for Social Concern. This man has so many gifts, it's unbelievable. I have a son who's a tennis player, so he plays downtown in South Bend, and there is a picture of Father Bob from like the 1950s leading tennis. So he actually was the coach. He created like half the sports here at Notre Dame. He created the theology department at Notre Dame. I was like, I don't know he created the Institute for Church Life before it was the Institute for Church Life. So this man, I think he knows every person in Latin America. So the first person I asked about our new Pope was Father Bob, because I know he'd been to meetings with him. Bob is very humble in many different ways, and Bob's the perfect person, continuing the legacy of Archbishop Romero, again, someone that he actually knew. So I'm going to turn things over to Father Bob Pelton, Holy Cross, who actually taught Father Don McNeil, who then created the Center for Social Concerns, who taught me. So we're continuing that legacy. I'm going to turn things over. Again, please welcome, again, a true hero in the church, a man who's very humble and should be recognized in many different ways, Father Bob Pelton. Thanks, Bob.
Thank you, Bill. It's not too bad being a grandfather. "50 years ago, when Pacem and Terris was delivered at the United Nations in the name of John the 23rd by Cardinal Leo Joseph Soenens of Belgium, who had a commitment to come here to Notre Dame immediately after his delivering the address. And since I was chair of theology at that time, I had the pleasure of being his host. We know that he went on to do remarkable work at Vatican II, and for 25 years after Vatican II was over. So that's one connection. This evening we have another important coincidence because Julian Filochowski of England worked closely with Archbishop Romero. He advised him at the 1979 Puebla Conference in Mexico. He organized Romero's petition by his friends for the Nobel Prize for Peace. Julian attended the funeral of Monsignor Romero on behalf of Cardinal Hume and the Episcopal Conference of England and Wales. Through his relations and friendship with Cardinal Hume and Romero's connections, he also was able to encourage Cardinal Sunens early on to have a deep interest and respect for Archbishop Romero. I'm not going to say all the other things about Julian that are in your program, so you can do that for your later reading tonight. He's going to address the theme of Oscar Romero, the martyrdom of an apostle for peace, and a Vatican II champion who now, in a very special way, challenges us, and particularly this evening. So let's give a hearty round of applause for Julian.
Thank you very much indeed, Father Bob, for that incredibly warm welcome. Ladies and gentlemen, brothers and sisters, dear friends, it's a great privilege and a great joy for this solidarity activist, which is how I describe myself, to deliver the 2013 Romero Lecture here at Notre Dame. Let me begin with Archbishop Romero's words. Even when they call us mad, when they call us subversives and communists, and all the epithets they throw at us, we know that we only preach the subversive witness of the Beatitudes, which have turned everything upside down, to proclaim blessed the poor, blessed the thirsting for justice, blessed the suffering, blessed the peacemaker. The Jesuit theologian Ignacio Ellacuría, who himself was later to join the gallery of El Salvador's martyrs, famously said, "With Archbishop Romero, God passed through El Salvador." I would prefer to say that with Archbishop Romero, God passed through the universal church. For me personally, it's been the greatest grace of my life to have known and worked with Archbishop Romero and to have enjoyed his friendship for 3 years. It was a fleeting glimpse of God at work in the world. As chair of the Archbishop Romero Trust in London, I've come to feel rather like a peripatetic evangelist, or perhaps a wandering minstrel, singing a song you've heard so many times before, the story of a Christ-like bishop, martyred at the altar for his profound and loving commitment to the poor, his fidelity to both the teaching and the genuine spirit of Vatican II, and his indefatigable pursuit of peace through justice. Still now, 33 years on, reflectively reading his homilies, his pastoral letters, and his diary strengthens me in faith and hope, but challenges me at the very core of my being to live out that Catholic Christian faith authentically. In this year of faith, we can surely hold up Oscar Romero with pride as a truly credible witness to the gospel and the resurrection of Jesus Christ for these skeptical times. The Church is in the midst of celebrating 50 years of Vatican II. And during these coming weeks, we focus on John the 23rd's 1963 encyclical Pacem in Terris. In that Cold War era, alongside a critique of the nuclear arms race and the stockpiling of weapons, as we heard last night from Ken Himes, Pope John entered a long discussion of human rights in the context of natural law. It is indeed the backbone of the encyclical. In fact, there is a defense of human rights to an extent that was quite new in the official pronouncements of the Church. And it was exceedingly pertinent to Archbishop Romero's context in El Salvador. Pope John went so far as to declare, any government which refuses to recognize human rights or acts in violation of them would not only fail in its duty, its decrees would be wholly lacking in binding force. Any government which acts in violation of human rights, its decrees would be wholly lacking in binding force. This extraordinarily powerful statement was echoed in Romero's homilies when he confronted the military regime with its most ignominious failings. And then, in a seemingly explicit reference to Latin America, Pope John wrote, in traditionally Christian states, civil institutions are often little influenced by Christian motives and a Christian spirit. In our opinion, the explanation lies in a certain cleavage between faith and practice. A certain cleavage. Well, in El Salvador, that was a massive understatement. Amongst the Catholic elite there was not a cleavage, but a chasm between the profession of Christian faith and adherence to Catholic social doctrine on the one side, and the lived practice in daily life on the other. But it's the beautiful peroration of Pacem in Terris that I would argue set the framework for Romero's ministry. Peace is but an empty word if it does not rest upon an order founded on truth, built upon justice, nurtured and animated by charity, and brought into effect under the auspices of freedom. That could be Oscar Romero's epitaph. What was being cruelly attempted in El Salvador was to shore up an order founded on cover-up and lies, built upon exploitation and repression, nurtured and animated by diatribe and fear, and brought into effect under the auspices of dictatorship. Dictatorship, unfortunately, supported by the governments of the United States and other Western democracies. And Pope John concludes his encyclical letter, and so, dear brother bishops, with the ardent wish that peace may come upon the flocks committed to your care, for the special benefit of those who are most lowly and in the greatest need of help and defense. In other words, he's saying, the poor come first. It was a felicitous and unmistakable allusion to a preferential option for the poor. Pacem in Terris arguably laid momentous foundations for the Second Vatican Council's pastoral constitution, Gaudium et Spes, which came 2 years later. And Gaudium et Spes, with its explicit call to scrutinize the signs of the times, became Romero's constant inspiration. He read those Salvadoran signs of the times in the light of the gospel. And at the same time, he interpreted the gospel in the light of the signs of the times. An approach to doing theology which Chicago theologian David Tracy describes as mutually critical correlation. May I quote just one passage of Gaudium et Spes? The Council wishes passionately to summon Christians to cooperate under the help of Christ, the author of peace, with all people to secure peace based on justice and love. Cooperate with all people, notice, not just fellow Catholics or fellow Christians, not just those who vote with us on pro-life issues, or those who share the Vatican's line on a whole gamut of issues linked to the anthropology of man. We are to cooperate with all people to secure peace based on justice. And it goes on, as Ken quoted last night. Peace is not merely the absence of war, nor can it be reduced to the maintenance of a balance of power between enemies, nor is it brought about by dictatorship. Instead, rightly and appropriately, peace is an enterprise of justice. Opus Justitiae Pax. Confronted with an avalanche of human rights violations in the midst of violent conflict and impending civil war, Romero adopted and adapted those words. He enriched them with the Medellin document on peace and Pope Paul VI's apostolic exhortation Evangelii Nunciandi, which Romero described as the Magna Carta of Evangelization. And he struggled ceaselessly for peace through justice in El Salvador. He said, "I will not tire of declaring that if we really want an effective end to violence, we must remove the violence that lies at the root of all violence: structural violence, social injustice, exclusion of citizens from the governance of the country, and repression. All this is what constitutes the primal cause from which the rest flows naturally." Paul VI's 1972 World Peace Day cry, taken from the prophet Isaiah, had been, "If you want peace, work for justice." It became Romero's banner. Indeed, we shall see it was his last breath. Romero's familiarity with and his ability to cite from memory key passages, not just from the documents of Vatican II, but from the whole corpus of magisterial social doctrine, and indeed from broader papal teaching, was hugely impressive. Starting from Leo XIII and Romero's hero, Pope Pius XI, right down to Medellin, Puebla, and John Paul II. He had studied and absorbed the documents, and their messages were at the core of his teaching and preaching and pastoral practice in San Salvador. In those 3 years, he delivered 193 homilies, and in them Romero quoted Lumen Gentium and Gaudium et Spes from Vatican II no less than 244 times. He preached the gospel and he preached the counsel. We could say that Gaudium et Spes and the constitutions and declarations of Vatican II were in his bloodstream. But building on Vatican II, the Latin American Church at Medellin, Colombia in 1968 had re-articulated and reinserted into Catholic social teaching what we now describe as the preferential option for the poor. And Romero and the church in San Salvador embraced it wholeheartedly. Pastoral action to protect human dignity and promote and defend basic human rights and freedoms emanates from our fundamental belief in the incarnation, that God became man. We are all equally sons and daughters of God, made in his image and likeness, therefore sisters and brothers of Jesus Christ, with all the inherent dignity and inalienable rights that flow from that. We constitute a single human family from which no one, but no one, is excluded. In a secular context, the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights and the associated covenants spell out many of those rights and the corresponding duties. But the Church's option for the poor, the gospel option for the poor, which is as old as the hills, goes further. Within that single human family, the poor come first. As Blessed John Paul II reminded us, in the poorest man or woman we meet Jesus himself in distressing disguise. So it's as stark and simple as that. The poor come first. First on our agenda, first in defining our priorities, first in the call on our resources, first in the focus of our mission. But more than that, the place where we might best reflect and discern is standing alongside the poor, looking at the world from the victim's perspective. That too is the place in which to do theology and to develop our spirituality. We are evangelized by the poor. The good news of the gospel is for the poor first of all. They are its privileged recipients. It is good news for us, the rich, whether we're in San Salvador, in London, or in Notre Dame, when we become good news for the poor. We might say that we save Lazarus and we are saved by Lazarus. That is the radical and seminal contribution of the Latin American Church to Catholic social thought, and which quite evidently Archbishop Romero actually inhabited. It's now freely, indeed routinely invoked in theological reflection, cited in episcopal statements and even papal encyclicals. So let's be clear. The option for the poor goes far beyond the secular commitment to human rights for all, far beyond equal opportunities for all. It says that the poor and the true friends of the poor will actually be called first when we register for God's kingdom. Oscar Romero's appointment as Archbishop of San Salvador 36 years ago, in February 1977, came as a shock to the clergy and the people of the diocese, and probably to Romero himself. In his pocket diary for the 8th of February 1977, he wrote self-effacingly, "Today it was announced in the newspapers that Monsignor Romero has been designated Archbishop of San Salvador." The man who eventually succeeded Romero, Bishop Rivera Damas, had been expected to get the post. He'd attended the Vatican Council and served as auxiliary bishop for over 16 years. He shared wholeheartedly the pastoral vision and apostolic priorities of the illustrious retiring Archbishop Chavez. And that was a vision of the church alongside the poor, a church of small basic communities, a strategy of conscientization and empowerment in the mold of Paulo Freire, a church where action and organizing with the poor to secure justice was truly a constitutive dimension of preaching and living the gospel, as the 1971 Synod of Bishops had so clearly proclaimed. But sadly, this Medellin Gaudium et Spes church was anathema to the wealthy landed elite and the military class who ruled El Salvador. They managed to persuade the Vatican authorities through a young and inexperienced nuncio and the arch-conservative Cardinal Mario Casariego in neighboring Guatemala, that they should instead appoint the apparently bland and socially conservative prelate Oscar Romero, who they mistakenly believed shared their own antipathy and distaste for this dangerous social involvement of the church. They felt sure that he would get these crazy clergy back into the sacristy and out of the public square. For their own part, members of the oligarchy were determined to hold on to their wealth, power, and privileges unchallenged by either the church or the rural populace. They steadfastly maintained structures of exploitation on the coffee, sugar, and cotton plantations that were being described in the language of Medellin as institutionalized violence. A land tenure system where 2% of the population owned 60% of the land, and where just 14 families had overwhelming dominance, where the legal minimum wage for a coffee picker was a fiction, even on the estates of distinguished Catholic landowners, where tens of thousands of landless campesinos scoured the countryside in search of a day's paid labor, where rural trade unions and peasant associations were simply outlawed, and where a flourishing agricultural export economy brought to the growing numbers of the rural poor only ever-increasing hardship, malnutrition, and real hunger. And where the opposition parties generally won the elections, but through systematic fraud, they always seemed to lose the count. The response to the ensuing social unrest and popular demonstrations was violent repression and the emergence of death squads, which in turn provoked the birth of left-wing guerrilla movements. This was the El Salvador that Romero, as Archbishop, had to come to terms with in 1977. A land of massacres and cruel killings, which had a long history going back to 1932. It was a nation pregnant with civil war, a country that was like an abscess, filling up with the poison of spiraling violence, an abscess which after Romero's death burst into bloody war. But the shy, loyal, orthodox Romero, the man they thought would cause no waves, changed and was changed. He was never going to be a political pawn of coffee barons, nor indeed of any grouping, be it on the right or the left. The only person who manipulated Romero was God, to whom he turned and with whom he communed in prayer over many hours each day and before every major decision, and into the night and early morning prior to every Sunday homily. Romero's installation as Archbishop in 1977 coincided with a massive presidential electoral fraud, followed by killings and unprecedented national tension. Romero had scarcely moved in when the Jesuit priest Rutilio Grande, at the very epicenter of the social conflict in the countryside, was murdered by a death squad as he drove to celebrate Mass in an outlying hamlet. His body was riddled with bullets, police bullets. Romero's initial disbelief became prophetic determination. He closed the Catholic high schools and colleges for 3 days, and the children were sent home with a question sheet for their parents to discuss what was happening in this country dedicated to our Savior, El Salvador, when priests were being killed. He suspended all formal relations with the government until the assassins would be brought to justice. He opened a diocesan legal aid center to document all the killings and disappearances, the rapes and the assaults, and to give pastoral support to the families and communities affected. But crucially, the following Sunday, he decreed that the churches of the diocese be closed and all the masses cancelled. He called the faithful to attend a single mass which he would celebrate in front of the cathedral, the Missa Unica. He preached eloquently about Father Rutilio to a crowd of over 100,000 people, a passionate witness to the ugly truth. Anyone who touches one of my priests touches me, he said. This response to Rutilio's death offers us a template for how Romero would react with apostolic courage and pastoral fortitude as the crises developed and the bloodshed increased in this country so very far from peace and accelerating towards war. Romero read those signs of the times. He saw the victims of the grotesque injustices that fueled conflict, and he spoke the truth of what was happening in the country when everywhere atrocities were covered up with lies. He read the situation from the perspective of the poor and interpreted it with the aid of the gospel and the magisterium of the church. He named the sins and called without fail for repentance and a change of heart. His weekly homilies became the principal vehicle for his teaching and pastoral outreach, on top of which he issued 4 beautiful pastoral letters. But alongside his preaching and his exhortations for peace and the renunciation of violence, which were a regular and even predictable feature of his homilies, he offered the services of the Archdiocese for efforts of mediation. He strived to promote meaningful dialogue as the alternative to the cacophony of vile diatribe. And most important of all, he responded pastorally and compassionately to the victims of terror and violence, whomsoever had been the perpetrators. After the Missa Unica, the anger of the wealthy Catholics from the landowning and commercial class and the military was palpable. And as in the case of Jesus early in his ministry, they began to plot against him. For his part, Romero visited dozens of different communities and parishes and heard their stories, their joys and their sorrows. People queued up to see him in his office, and he listened till late into the night. Repression intensified and was documented, as too the kidnappings, church occupations, and strikes organized on the left. No real dialogue proved possible with the government. Statements after meetings that did take place were used to manipulate Romero. The national press belonged to the same wealthy families, and they censored out all Romero's concerns, but they did carry page after page of advertisements from ghost or fake organizations like the Companions of Christ the King, the Association of Loyal Catholic Women, denouncing the clergy and the church and insulting Romero grossly. Romero wrote to a fellow bishop in Bogota at that time with great prescience, "My new post seems to have put me on the road to Calvary." The kidnapping and murder 2 months later by leftist guerrillas of Foreign Minister Mauricio Borgonovo, whose release Romero had been desperately seeking to secure, was followed immediately, despite Romero's pleadings against revenge, by the killing of a second priest, Father Alfonso Navarro. At the funeral, he declared, "Violence is produced not only by those who kill, but by those who urge to kill. Violence is criminal, even in those who merely do not do whatever is possible to uncover its origins. They are sinners as much as those who point the weapons to kill." If we stand back, we can see Romero's mission was no more nor less than evangelization in its fullest sense, preaching the gospel as good news to the poor and making that good news a reality in people's lives. He was the evangelizer par excellence. The church, he said, wants to offer no other contribution than that of the gospel. It has no purely political contribution to make, nor any merely human skill to offer. Quite truthfully, the church is interested only in offering the country the light of the gospel for the full salvation and betterment of men and women, but a salvation that also involves the structures within which Salvadorans live, so that rather than get in their way, the structures can help them live out their lives as children of God. But evangelization is not just saying words. Preaching is relatively easy, but to live out what is preached, when one tries to give that teaching life in our diocese, then conflicts arise. And together with fellow bishops, Romero went on to say, very challengingly, "We would be false to our mission as shepherds if we were to reduce evangelization to mere practices of individualistic piety and disincarnate sacramentalism." Disincarnate sacramentalism. There is food for thought for all of us. Romero's theology is best described as the theology of the Beatitudes. The Beatitudes are not something we can understand fully, he said. And that is why there are those, young people especially, who think that the love of the Beatitudes is not going to bring about a better world, and who opt for violence, for guerrilla war, for revolution. The church will never make that its path. Let it be clear, I repeat, that the church does not choose those ways of violence. And whatever is said to that effect is slander. The church's option is for what Christ says in the Beatitudes. Romero contended that only if we put the Beatitudes into practice can we build that civilization of love to which we all aspire. He said, "A civilization of love is not sentimentality, it is justice and truth. A civilization of love that did not demand justice for people would not be true civilization. Because of this, it is only a caricature of love when we try to patch up with charity what is owed in justice, when we cover up with an appearance of benevolence what we are failing in social justice. True love means demanding what is just. Romero's own space was his cathedral, and with other channels close to him, from his pulpit, from his cathedra, there at the Sunday Mass, he spoke the truth and denounced the evil taking place, week in, week out, clearly and unambiguously. And he thereby gave hope and consolation to his people. His homilies were major occasions to interweave catechesis and communication of the social reality. He carefully, almost surgically, unpacked the readings and interpreted them in the context of El Salvador. He was beautifully clear with inspired metaphor, didactic repetition, and verbal fluidity. Then came the good news of the week. The gatherings and meetings, the celebrations and patronal feasts, and the visitors and the letters of solidarity. Then the bad news. Incident by incident, atrocity by atrocity, he named the victims, all the victims, what had happened, where and when, and who was responsible. He sought justice, supported recompense, and offered pastoral care. And this methodology was the forerunner of the truth commissions that would emerge in future years around the world. But let's pause just for a moment and think about what Archbishop Romero had to confront over those 3 years. Here is my list of 20. He faced and sought to respond to pervasive and extreme poverty, to paramilitary killings of community leaders, to peasant massacres and the indiscriminate shooting of urban demonstrators by the security forces, to the torture and disappearance of political prisoners, to the decapitation and mutilation of death squad victims, to the assassination of 6 of his priests and dozens of catechists, to the deportation of foreign clergy, to the desecration of churches and their tabernacles, to the threat from the White Warriors Union to exterminate all the Jesuits in the country, to the bombings of the diocesan radio station and diocesan printing press, to the discovery of a suitcase of dynamite placed behind the altar at his Sunday Mass, to the corruption of the Supreme Court and the judiciary, to the suspension of habeas corpus and constitutional guarantees through a so-called law of public order, to the arrival of a military-civilian junta installed by military coup, to the kidnapping and execution by armed leftist groups of local and foreign businessmen, of government ministers and other public figures, to the occupations of churches, the cathedral, embassies and government ministries by popular movements, to conflictive and paralyzing strikes, to continuous campaigns of slander and defamation in the press, and to death threats, both from the right and from the left. He preached and he spoke out, trying desperately to find the words to convey the horror of what was happening in a deeply Catholic country, which he said had come to resemble the dominion of hell. In retrospect, his statements seem rather mild. I am grieved that our people continue to be massacred merely for taking to the street to petition for justice and liberty. What have we to show to Christ in El Salvador in Holy Week? Nothing but a week of bloodshed. My job is to go round picking up the dead bodies of the victims of the persecution of the church. I do not understand, Mr. President, how you can declare yourself before the nation Catholic by upbringing and by conviction, and yet allow these unspeakable outrages on the part of the security forces in a country we call civilized and Christian. And would that this reflection might persuade Salvadorans to lay unjust attitudes aside and to wash clean so many hands and consciences stained by social injustice and human blood. Romero knew and continually cited in his homilies the statistics of poverty, deprivation, and repression. But for him, the statistics were simply human beings with the tears wiped off. And just like the Good Samaritan of the Gospel parable, who tended the man beaten up and left for dead by the roadside, Romero was moved to compassion. And we could use the same expressive Greek word as St. Luke, esplagniste. There was a churning in the depths of his bowels. It was literally gut-wrenching for Romero. Romero's messages were no to the killings of the right, no to the violence of the left. This is what we preach: no to vengeance, no to class struggle, no to violence. 4 times he made explicit the excommunication that the torturers and assassins of his priests had brought upon themselves. But bringing about peace among the warring factions in El Salvador was not a simple matter. A centuries-long history of repression and exploitation was at long last being questioned and resisted. The only way to avoid violence, Romero insisted, was by means of sustained, brutally honest dialogue on the part of the government, private capital, trade unions, popular organizations, and rebels. He told BBC television journalists, "The best solution is a return to love and a sincere desire to achieve dialogue. A level of trust must be established so that people can freely express their opinions. And all groups must be included in any dialogue designed to arrive at a solution." Romero constantly offered the church's mediation, especially in the case of labor or land disputes, or in the case of kidnappings. But the violence intensified remorselessly, and Romero devoted a substantial part of his 3rd and 4th pastoral letters to an examination of violence, distinguishing between the arbitrary or repressive violence of the state, which uses brute force, and the structural or institutional violence that works through mechanisms that are legal but just as brutal in their effects on the people. And then the terrorist violence of the right and the left, which is different again from insurrectional violence and from the violence of legitimate defense. Inspired by the gospel, he said, "The church feels itself driven to seek peace before all else. But the peace that the church urges is the work of justice. Therefore, its judgments on the violence that disturbs the peace cannot ignore the demands of justice. There are many different judgments, just as there are many different forms of violence. The church cannot just state in a simplistic fashion that it condemns every kind of violence. And when the church decries revolutionary violence, it cannot forget that institutionalized violence also exists, and that the desperate violence of oppressed persons is not overcome with one-sided laws, with weapons, or with superior force. Instead, as the Pope says, revolutionary violence must be prevented by courageous self-sacrifice and by giving up many comforts." And whilst rejecting violence over and over again, violence is not Christian, violence is not human, nothing violent can long endure, Romero doggedly pressed for profound, urgent, but non-violent changes. He said yes to political organization, yes to dialogue, yes to social justice for the poor, yes to human rights for all Salvadorans, and yes to the practice of compassion. As if all this were not enough to contend with on his road to Calvary, he also had to cope within the church with the open hostility of 4 out of 6 fellow bishops, and the thinly veiled disapproval of the papal nuncio and several high-ranking officials of the Roman Curia. It was Romero's crown of thorns. To counter that episcopal isolation, I and Tom Quigley, a fellow co-conspirator in crime from the United States Catholic Conference, we set about connecting Romero with other prophetic bishops in South America, similarly attacked and scorned for their defense of the poor. For my part, I brought letters of affirmation and endorsement for his evangelical approach from Cardinal Hume in London, Cardinal Sounens in Brussels, and Cardinal Marty in Paris, 3 of the most senior and respected cardinals in the world. This solidarity brought Romero great consolation and disarmed many critics who'd insisted he was completely out of step with the mainstream church. In 1978, after coordinating his Nobel Peace Prize nomination in the British Parliament, which we dared hope might protect Romero from physical harm, I accompanied a delegation of those same parliamentarians to El Salvador to meet Archbishop Romero. They came to tell him formally of his Nobel candidature and to make an assessment of the deteriorating human rights situation. Not only did we interview government and church figures, we heard searing testimonies from victims of the repression and families of the disappeared. And then, against all the odds, I don't know how we managed it, we talked our way from the Ministry of Defense into the National Guard headquarters. And following clues that had been given to us by Amnesty International, we managed to find the interrogation rooms and torture cells used with political prisoners. And we published that discovery to the world. There was a certain grim satisfaction in being able to corroborate Archbishop Romero's denunciations of torture. I later learned that one of the Salvadoran bishops was at the same time actually conspiring with the military government to try to thwart Romero's Nobel candidature, as is demonstrated in this transcript of a telephone intercept between the bishop and a general on the president's entourage. And that happened whilst the delegation was actually present in San Salvador. In February 1980, Romero sent an open letter to President Jimmy Carter, asking for a halt to US military assistance to El Salvador, which he said was being used to kill innocent campesinos. In other words, it was directly aiding and abetting the repressive violence of the state. This was a momentous letter, a wake-up call to the United States churches to intensify their solidarity, their lobbying, and their campaigning over military aid to the Salvadoran regime. As El Salvador edged towards war, the threats and insults became so intense, a fever existed. Romero knew he was going to die. Those around him tried to persuade him to have a bulletproof vest or a bodyguard. His response was simple. Why should the shepherd have protection when his sheep are still prey to wolves? Just before he died, in an interview with a Mexican newspaper, he said, "I have frequently been threatened with death. I ought to say that as a Christian, I do not believe in death without resurrection. If they kill me, I will rise again in the people of El Salvador. I'm not boasting. I say it with the greatest humility. Martyrdom is a grace from God which I do not believe I deserve. But can you tell them, if they succeed in killing me, that I pardon and bless those who do it? But I wish that they could realize that they're wasting their time. A bishop may die, but the church of God, which is the people, will never die. At the Mass on Sunday, March the 23rd, the day before he died, in an extraordinary homily, he tackled the most difficult question that was insistently being put to him. How should the ordinary soldiers respond when put under orders to kill and to massacre? At this desperate crisis juncture, Romero felt he could not evade the issue, however outrageous his intervention might seem to the military. Let's listen to the climactic conclusion.
Yo quisiera hacer un llamamiento de manera especial a los hombres del ejército y en concreto a las bases de la Guardia Nacional, de la policía, de los cuarteles.
I'd like to appeal in a special way to the Army's enlisted men, the ranks of the National Guard and Police.
Matan a sus mismos hermanos campesinos.
Brothers, you're part of our own people. You kill your own campesino brothers
Y
and
ante
sisters.
una orden de matar que dé un hombre, debe de prevalecer la ley de Dios que dice no matar.
Before an order to kill that a man may give, God's law must prevail. Thou shalt not kill.
Ningún soldado está obligado a obedecer una orden contra la ley de Dios.
No soldier is obliged to obey an order against the law of God.
Una ley inmoral, nadie tiene que cumplirla.
And in moral law, nobody has to obey it.
Ya es tiempo de que recuperen su conciencia y que obedezcan antes a su conciencia que a la orden del pecado.
It's time to obey your consciences rather than the orders of sin.
La Iglesia, defensora de los derechos de
Church,
Dios,
defender
de la
of the
ley de
rights,
Dios, de la dignidad humana,
the
de la
rights, human
persona,
rights and human dignity,
no puede quedarse callada
cannot remain silent
ante tanta abominación.
before such abominations.
Queremos que el gobierno tome en serio que de nada sirven las reformas si van teñidas con tanta sangre.
The governments realise the reforms are worth nothing if they come drenched in blood.
En nombre de Dios, pues,
In the name of God,
y en nombre de este sufrido pueblo,
the name of this suffering
cuyos
people,
lamentos suben hasta el cielo cada día más tumultuosos,
whose laments reach up to heaven,
les suplico,
I beg you,
les ruego,
I beseech you,
les ordeno,
I
en
order
nombre
you,
de Dios,
in the name of
cese la
God,
represión.
stop the repression now. Archbishop Romero had pronounced his own death sentence, and he knew it. He discussed what he was going to say at length with his closest advisors. All else had failed to stop the slaughter and the march to war. It was his last stand. The military high command read it as incitement to mutiny, and an already existing plan for Romero's assassination was activated. And you know the rest. At 6:25 p.m. the next day, Monday, March the 24th, 1980, Archbishop Romero is celebrating a memorial mass in the chapel of the cancer hospital where he lived. His homily is a reflection on John's gospel. Unless a grain of wheat falls into the earth and dies, it remains just a single grain. But if it dies, it yields a rich harvest. Romero stands and speaks at the altar. It's not a long homily by Romero's standards, just 10 minutes. He concludes and moves from the left to the center of the altar to pick up the chalice and the paten with the words, "May this body broken and this blood shed for human beings encourage us to give our body and blood up to suffering and pain as Christ did, not for self, but to bring justice and peace for our people." He's actually dedicating his life to justice and peace, no less. And it's certain that at that moment, from the altar, he saw the assassin take aim through the open door of the chapel. He'd known he was going to die, and he'd prepared himself for the moment. He didn't shout out, fearing that those around him in the congregation would be killed too. But he flinched, the body's natural reflex action, and a great cold sweat poured out of his body. The marksman fired from the open door, and the single bullet entered his body just above the heart. He slumped to the floor at the foot of a huge crucifix, with blood pouring from his mouth, nostrils, and ears. Pandemonium followed. He was packed into the back of a pickup truck, and he was declared dead on arrival at the emergency hospital. Amazingly, a nun on the front bench had a micro-cassette tape recorder. And so this evening, here in this hall in Notre Dame, we're in a position to press the button and replay the martyrdom of the Apostle of Peace. Listen carefully to these 60 seconds or so. They're the virtually inaudible last words of Archbishop Romero, and then the execution shot.
Es precisamente un acto de fe. Por fe cristiana sabemos que en este momento la hostia de trigo se convierte en el cuerpo del Señor que se ofreció por la redención del mundo y que en ese cáliz el vino se transforma en la sangre que fue precio de la salvación. Que este cuerpo inmolado y esta sangre sacrificada por los hombres nos alimente también a dar nuestro cuerpo y nuestra sangre al sufrimiento y al dolor como Cristo, no para sí, sino para dar posesión de justicia y de paz a nuestro pueblo. Unamos pues íntimamente en fe y esperanza a este momento de oración por doña Salinda y por nosotros.
Amazingly, there was also a photographer present who took pictures of those moments. He's fallen down after the shot. They're standing up to look at the altar. Women of Jerusalem. And so they killed him. The Good Shepherd had laid down his life for his flock. But not in Russia or China or Afghanistan, not assassinated by atheists, communists, or Islamist fanatics, but in one of the most Catholic countries in the world, the Metropolitan Archbishop in the capital city was shot dead in the middle of Mass. It was carried out by a death squad linked to the nation's armed forces, close allies of the Pentagon, in an operation planned, approved, and financed by wealthy and powerful members of the Catholic oligarchy. Happily, in 2010, Mauricio Funes, the current president of El Salvador, offered an official apology to Romero's family and the people of El Salvador for the complicity of the state in the magnicide and in the subsequent cover-up of what was no less than a crime against humanity. I believe we must ask ourselves what remembering Archbishop Romero means and should mean today. There's John Paul at his tomb in '84. There's President Obama at his current tomb a year or so ago. There's the statue over the west door of Westminster Abbey, the Anglican Communion's canonization of Romero. There is the UN resolution passed by the General Assembly declaring Romero Day to be an international day to be celebrated across the world, concerning truth on human rights in Romero's honor and memory. The fundamental Christian model of remembering is do this in memory of me. For the Church to remember Archbishop Romero must first mean to continue his work, not only loving the poor, but actually defending the poor, pursuing justice for the crucified peoples of our world, and taking risks for peace and the kingdom of God. And like him, it means to struggle with all the paradoxes and conflicts that such a commitment throws up for us. Indeed, he warned us in no uncertain terms, a church that suffers no persecution, but enjoys the privileges and support of the things of the earth, beware, this is not the true church of Jesus Christ. Romero has shown us all that the preferential option for the poor is not just some meaningless rhetoric from the late 20th century. He lived it. And so he challenges us. And if we truly commit ourselves, then the option for the poor is doable, even for bishops. With Archbishop Romero, there was no cleavage between faith and practice, between his orthodoxy and his orthopraxis. The rhetoric of his preaching and teaching and his concomitant pastoral actions were absolutely coherent, consistent, and mutually reinforcing. He talked the talk and he walked the walk, and that is part of the key to his greatness. As a pastor and a church leader, Archbishop Romero amassed colossal moral authority, which is still recognized today. At the present time, I believe the moral authority of the church is very much diminished. Nevertheless, across the globe, Oscar Romero is embraced with admiration, with affection, and with pride as an icon of holiness, a model of a bishop, and an heroic Christian witness for these troubled ecclesial times. He was utterly orthodox and utterly radical. Romero was the enemy of cover-up and spin, which is today's all-pervasive sin. He spoke the truth fearlessly, prophetically. We have too many Nicodemus Christians today, bishops and lay people alike, afraid to speak the truth in public about contemporary controversies that affect the church and the world. Romero's road to martyrdom reminds us that maintaining the unity of the bishops' conference is not a fundamental kingdom value. And saving the face of the hierarchy can never trump speaking the truth about the violation of human rights and securing justice for the abused and the excluded. Romero was a deeply spiritual man with a rich prayer life. His example to us is the beautiful and, dare I say it, the seamless synthesis he made in living and witnessing to faith and promoting peace with justice, an apostle of peace. He's not a martyr because they killed him. They killed him because he was a martyr, a witness to the truth, a witness to the magisterium of the church, a witness to Vatican II, and indeed a witness to Pacem in Terris. Thank you.
Julian would welcome some questions or observations, and there are a couple of microphones on both sides, so please, we welcome them ourselves.
First, let me simply express great gratitude for your elocution, for your faithfulness, for your inspiration. This is perhaps one of the most moving keynote talks I've ever heard. Thank you. A simple question, if I may. Why has Archbishop Romero not been raised to sainthood in the Roman Catholic Church?
Well, there's a short answer and a long answer. John Sobrino said it's easy to canonize people who love the poor. It's much more tricky for people who defend the poor. Romero's canonization process began as soon as it could in 1990 on the 10th anniversary of his martyrdom. The diocesan process went along as smoothly as could be expected, and jumping a lot of detail, it went to Rome with the recommendation of the Archdiocese, indeed the recommendation of the then Opus Dei Archbishop to Rome in the late 1990s. In Rome, there were a lot of things needed to be done in getting support together. There was no money for it, for the process, but a lot of activities were done. The problem was that there were people in Rome that were actively opposed to Romero's beatification and canonization. They were people who stood to look themselves humiliated, people who'd attacked Romero and the likes of Romero and thought that he was a stooge for liberation theology and that if he would be recognized, that would be for them. I think the nuncio in London put it to me one occasion when I said, why doesn't this happen? He said, Julian, the beatification of Romero would be the damnification of others. And it's clear a group of Latin American cardinals were doing their very best to stop things. Pope John Paul II wanted to beatify him, and that has to be put clearly on the record. There's a long story about John Paul II and Romero, but it ended very well, and he kept asking when could he beatify him. But they persuaded the then Cardinal Ratzinger in the Congregation of the Doctrine of the Faith to do an examination of Romero's orthodoxy. And so everything he'd ever written, every speech he'd ever given was gone through with a fine-tooth comb. And I understand, well, I can't prove it, that in 2005, just before he became Pope, the Congregation of the Doctrine of the Faith recognized that he was completely orthodox. But what's happened since then? I don't know. Benedict became Pope. He spoke 3 times very positively about Romero, in particular on the plane to Aparecida, to the Latin American bishops' meeting in 2007, 8, 7, saying the key words were, Monsignor Romero merits beatification. So you think, well, that's done and dusted. That's what the Holy Father has said. But there were all kinds of addendums, or addenda, saying, but the time has to be right, and people take advantage of it for political reasons, and I don't know. So we struggle along. We get bishops to ask questions in Rome, and they're always told, work continues. So we've been waiting. And essentially, it's been blocked. We don't know how or why. But now we feel very confident that the Pope Francis I will move this forward. He has spoken to people at that same meeting of Aparecida, saying that he believed Romero should be canonized. And he has been indicating all week that he'll do something. This Sunday is Palm Sunday, so and it's 24th of March. That's the anniversary of his martyrdom. Also being Palm Sunday, it's the same time the anniversary of his burial, which the following Sunday was Palm Sunday. And he is going to announce on Sunday that he's going to go to Brazil for the World Youth Day. In other words, he's going to talk about Latin America come what may. So we're hoping and praying, and so you get on your knees tonight and pray that he's going to bring Archbishop Romero into play. And around Rome, according to the tablet correspondent, all the view is that he's going to be announced. There'll be some stage an announcement of the beatification. John Paul will be in October this year, and that Romero would be in 2014. I hope, I pray. We've had so many false dawns, so we won't shout and clap until the fat lady sings.
Thank you so much for bringing Oscar Romero's witness to life here in this room so richly. I thought you did a really helpful job of helping us to think about what is and isn't violence and drawing on Romero's thought. Can you say a little bit more about what kind of violence, if any, Oscar Romero would approve of or did, or what his thinking was about that?
I don't think I think from the words I was quoting, he didn't approve of any violence. But the judgments he would make would be different in certain cases. And he was constantly saying he was being called upon to denounce what he called revolutionary violence. And he would not do that without denouncing the prior violence, institutionalized violence that was going on. He tried very hard, the military junta, I didn't mention any of that in the lecture. When that came along, he felt that there was a chance here for a peaceful way out. And he supported them if they would have reforms which would deal with it. He then he'd been attacked by the right very strongly up to then. He then was attacked by the left, who said that the junta was a United States CIA plot with the military to prevent the revolutionary change. And Romero said to them, you're using this for an end which is not the common good. But as it got closer and closer, I don't think he would have condemned if something became insurrectional violence. But I don't know, he wouldn't have approved it. He never described himself as a pacifist, but he wanted no part in any kind of violence at all. And anybody that tries to find, and some people have tried to use him as a backer for the FMLN guerrillas, and they use his picture shamelessly. And he would not have approved of that. And there is absolutely not a jot or tittle of doubt about it. And his homilies, when they were published at the time, his denunciations in the press in the United States and in Europe, of course everybody focused on the fact that he was pointing out what was happening by the armed forces and the killings that were grotesque. But at the same time, he never, when there was anything that happened by the left, which was at that time much less, but it was happening, he denounced it with the same thing. There was absolutely no partisanship about it. So I don't know. He never described himself as a pacifist, but I don't think he would have wanted any part of it. He might have said, this has become inevitable, as the Nicaraguan bishops very reluctantly did when the Sandinista insurrection took place.
Thank you.
Yes, thanks for your address this evening. No doubt before he died, he thought very carefully about asking soldiers to disobey their superiors. And I would imagine he must have contemplated the thought that he would leave his flock without a shepherd. We know the answer he gave. Can you enlighten us as to why he eventually made that decision?
Well, it's very difficult to describe the intensity of the feeling at the time. The atmosphere was that something was in the air. As I tried to say, he was being asked that by soldiers that were listening to him, and they were being ordered to shoot people mercilessly in massacre. And some of them were coming asking, what does Archbishop say we should do? And I don't think he evaded it, but he didn't answer it for quite a while. But as this was getting closer and closer, and then he said he couldn't do anything else. The day before, if you see the film Monsignor, which Father Pelton made, there's a discussion by his legal advisor saying, I had to say to him, Father, this will technically be seen as a delito, an offense, a crime. It can be seen that way. And he had an argument with the lawyer, and then he's saying to him, well, shouldn't I do it? And he said, well, ethically, I agree with you, but I'm just pointing out to you as your legal advisor, legally this is the case. And so he went through this discussion with a lot of people, and I'm sure he prayed and prayed and prayed all night about it, and decided he would do it. And it's been likened by others to Jesus overthrowing the tables in the temple. That was Jesus' last attempt, and of course it was a provocative act. He knew it was, but he knew he was going to die the day that he was going to be killed. He was a very orderly man. You might imagine that, but he was a very orderly man, and he had a very strict routine. On that Monday afternoon, he made a special and unexpected visit to his confessor, Father Asque, a Jesuit. And he told the Jesuit he wanted to go to confession because he wanted to be clean when he met God. So he knew what was going to happen. And in that sense, he was a martyr in the sense that he was a Eucharistic martyr. He was a given life, not a life that was taken away and he was made a victim. It was a given life. And I can't say any more than that, really.
Your presentation has been excellent. And as I see, you have done a lot of research in presenting your speech this evening. But I'm wondering that I'm missing a couple of things. That El Salvador was a Catholic country, is a Catholic country, and such repression was going on there. The assassination of people, massacre of people was such a large number, 80,000 or so. But I'm wondering, where was the world? Where was the church? Was there any condemnation from other part of the church? Was there any condemnation from other countries? If you compare with now, Christians who are in a tiny minority, for example, Pakistan, our federal minister was assassinated, and there was condemnation from the whole world. Holy Father Pope Benedict sent a message of condolences. Obama condemned his killing, and so many other leaders. And now, the world takes notice what's going on in Syria. Killing is there, and the whole world is making reservations and raising voices. Stop it, stop it. But why it did not stop in Salvador? From 77 to 80, 3 years, where was the world? Where was the church?
Well, my answer to you would be, I think it would be good at some stage to read a little bit of the Latin American history of that time. But El Salvador wasn't unique. So Chile, which is Father Pelton's special place, had a military coup which had thousands and thousands of people killed in Pinochet. Argentina, you're reading about the dirty war and the involvement or non-involvement of the present Pope. That was a very nasty military regime, killing lots of people in ways that were at least as cruel as in El Salvador. People indeed accused the El Salvadoran military of being trained by the Argentinians. Brazil still had a military dictatorship, the biggest country in Latin America. Bolivia had a horrible military dictatorship of General Banza. Peru had a slightly more reformist military dictatorship. Ecuador had a military dictatorship. You had Colombia, Venezuela, sort of democracies at the top. Central America, the Nicaraguan, the first part of Romero's time, had one of the worst dictatorships in Latin America's Somoza. In the middle of it, there was a revolution. Guatemala had a military regime which was later to do even worse things than the Salvadorans did. Honduras had a military regime that was a little bit more benign, but not much. Costa Rica was a democracy, Mexico was Mexico. So, well, what can you say? So you had a continent that was enveloped in this military dictatorship, and they were all Catholic countries. They were all these places. The military in these places, largely speaking, were Catholic. So all when we're talking today about knowledge and as a distinct to doing something, this cleavage between what they know, what they say they believe, and what they do, this is a problem for us all now today as it was then. And El Salvador was no different. There were a lot of governments that did things they could. Our parliament from Britain went there. Tom Quigley from the US conference got a lot of American congressmen, Democratic congressmen involved. In Carter's time, they were interested in human rights. They did some things, but it was a strategic ally. The American government didn't want the Cubans to arrive in Central America through these guerrillas and the whole ideology they had about this. So it was a very complex thing, but people were concerned. The Vatican and the Church, well, they were a big problem for Romero. I've explained it to you. It's really quite shocking. If they'd given more support to Romero, he probably wouldn't have been killed. I mean, the people that killed him saw him as someone who was marginalized by the other bishops, by the nuncio, by the church. He was seen as a black sheep, someone was out on a limb. And so when they got very angry at the end, they thought, well, we could get away with this. So if he'd been actually embraced at the bosom of the church in a more demonstrative way, then maybe he wouldn't have died. But then maybe the history would have been very different. We have a great, great martyr who's given his life for the poor, and I think he's shown us so many things. And I think his martyrdom is a great gift. And I think we thank the Lord for his martyrdom, not lament it.
What a way to begin Holy Week. One more round of applause.